The Nintendo 64 defined so many genres with iconic games. It was pretty starved for good RPGs though. If you wanted to go with the classic turn-based game, you had something like Paper Mario, and well, that's kind of it. In fact, if you look up N64 RPGs, you'll see lists including things like Gauntlet Legends, Harvest Moon 64, and Pokemon Stadium. And in my opinion, those kind of don't really count. However, there was one other turn-based RPG that is infamous amongst the Nintendo heads. Quest 64. It is a game that is lambasted by YouTubers and cited amongst fans as one of the worst games on the console. And in my opinion, it doesn't deserve that much vitriol.
Maybe a little bit, but not that much. Hey everyone, and welcome to another brand new episode of The Completionist, where we don't just beat the games, we complete them. And today, we're looking at one of the best RPGs on the Nintendo 64. Mostly because it's one of the only RPGs on the N64. So to set myself up on this generic role-playing journey, I will prepare a potion made of the four main elements of magic needed to restore balance to any fantasy kingdom. Earth. Perfect. Water. It's like Captain Planet up in here. Fire. Fire. And wind. Mix it all up. And there you go. The power to save the world.
Aren't you gonna drink it?
No.
Drink it.
No.
Drink it.
I'm not drinking this.
Drink
This
it.
is gross. That. That's stupid. Watch the video. Jesus. I'm not gonna drink this shit. What are you? There's dirt in here. Dirt and water.
Drink it.
No! You drink it!
Yes! All glory goes to the winner! Game over. Wake up! Last one standing wins.
Hey folks, today's sponsor, you'll never guess who it is. It's our good old pals over at G Fuel. Now, check this out. They have a brand new Mega Man collection set. You can get the Energy Formula Blue Bomber Slushie, as well as this collectible cool little shaker. This little Mega Man arm, go pew pew baby. G Fuel's been a huge sponsor of the show for the last several years. We appreciate them supporting us still. If you don't know, G Fuel essentially is a powder mixture that you can put in water or even tea or milk, whatever you prefer. Mix it up. It's got no sugar. It's got some caffeine, so be careful out there. They also have some uncaffeinated flavors. And hey, they love working with us. You guys love it because you keep buying it, so I appreciate the support. This is one of their newest flavors you can get right now over at gfuel.com. And hey, be sure to use code Completionist on checkout because you might get a discount. Again, gfuel.com, use code Completionist on checkout. Thank you to G Fuel. Thank you to you guys at home for watching. And hey, back to the show.
1998 was an incredible time for RPGs, with classics like Baldur's Gate on PC, Panzer Dragoon Saga on the Saturn, Suikoden 2 on PlayStation. Suikoden? Either way, you know what I mean. If you look at that list, or paid any attention to the beginning of this video, there is one major console missing here in this lineup, the Nintendo 64. This is strange because prior to this console, Nintendo had an RPG powerhouse. Across both the NES and the SNES, they had brought players many great franchises like Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, Mother or Earthbound, so many more. Why weren't any of these series represented on Nintendo's newest endeavor? There are a few factors to this, but the biggest reason was rival hardware. RPGs are big games that need a lot of power behind them that the N64 just didn't really have, at least in the way that people could figure out how to use. Not only was the PlayStation just a flat-out better hardware experience, but it was easier to develop for and released a whole 2 years before the Nintendo 64. Because of this, a lot of big developers like Squaresoft turned their favor towards Sony's first console. This meant that the only only RPG franchise left for Nintendo to bring to the next generation was another entry in the Mother series, and possibly Mario RPG. While the latter saw a spiritual successor with Paper Mario, Mother 3 went through development hell for 12 years before releasing only in Japan in 2006 on the Game Boy Advance. And you all know how I feel about that bad boy. Fortunately, Imagineer was there to fill that RPG-shaped hole in Nintendo's heart. Now, they were mainly known for distributing and publishing games in Japan, but Imagineer did have some experience in developing games. This was going to be their first real opportunity to make a mark overseas with something original. This was the moment for a video game company where they could put themselves on the map, just like Squaresoft did with Final Fantasy back in 1987. And the game they released was Quest 64. Critics everywhere gave this game a resounding shrug, followed by lots of critics looking in really hoped that this could be the RPG that could prove to be successfully done on the Nintendo 64. The overall game ended up becoming very generic, and I agree with that. I mean, look at the title, Quest 64. You go on a quest and you're playing on the N64. Done. No more questions, please. Yes, other RPGs have had generic fantasy names, but there was at least something behind them. Final Fantasy got its name because it was Squaresoft's final chance at success before they shut down the company. Hell, even Dragon Quest had the sense to put the word dragon before the word quest. And what's especially strange is that the game had other cooler, albeit weird, titles. In Japan, Quest 64 was called L-Tail Monsters. That's pretty cool, and it kind of makes sense. It's a tale about the elements and you fight monsters. Makes sense to me, but the best name came with the European release, Holy Magic Century. The only one of those words that has anything to do with the game is magic, but I can't deny I am incredibly intrigued. There's also a Game Boy Color remake called Quest Brian's Journey. This is a slightly more specific form of generic stuff, but once again, the other title is way better. Elemental Tale, Jack's Great Adventure, Satan's Counterattack. Holy crap, there's a lot happening there, and now I really want to play that game. Unfortunately, it's a bad and forgotten Game Boy port of a Nintendo 64 game, and IGN gave it a 4 out of 10. Sorry, I'm going off topic here. It seems that the story of Quest 64 is as generic as that title. You control Brian, an apprentice mage from the Monastery of the Mages. Your father left the monastery to find the thief who stole the Elatail book. It's now your job to find him. On top of that, you need to gather the gems representing the 4 elements of magic in order to beat a big bad boss at the very end of the game. Okay, so there's no new ground being tread here, but it's also nothing offensive, so we're kind of okay there. However, if you asked someone who bought this game at the time what they think of it now, they'll tell you it's one of the worst games to ever come out on the Nintendo 64. And that's saying something for a console that had some pretty terrible games. Clearly they haven't experienced Superman or Hey You Pikachu.
I think the thing that really sets Quest 64 back was the time in which it was released, right? When you're being compared to beloved classics like Final Fantasy VII or Suikoden 2, you're gonna look 10 times worse. And the closest thing to compare Quest 64 to on its own console was Ocarina of Time. And you're not going to be more well received than Ocarina of Time. Look, Too Fast, Too Furious isn't a terrible movie, but it does exactly what it wants to do, and that's fine. When you compare it to the classic action movies that came out in the same year, like Pirates of the Caribbean or Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, obviously it's going to look bad. That's exactly what happened to Quest 64, and believe it or not, I actually enjoyed my time with the game. For a while.
When you hear that a game is as notoriously terrible as Quest 64, you prepare yourself for the worst. Especially because I never really got to play Quest 64 as a kid. This was one of those games that I would often rent from Blockbuster and not really know what I was doing because I was too young to know what to do. It happens every now and then. There are some games like that. Funny how Quest 64 was hard to play, but Final Fantasy VII was easy. However, I was shocked to learn that when it came to Quest 64, not only was the beginning of the game not bad, but I actually enjoyed it myself. And you start the game off talking to the leader of the Monastery of the Mages, and he gives you all the basic info regarding the story. You then go down a lot of stairs until you eventually get outside. And I gotta be real here, it's a really great moment. Celtland is based off of Ireland, and it really shows. The overworld is bright, green, and fun to run around in. Plus, by having you start in a giant cramped tower, it makes the outside seem so much more expansive. It's a cool effect. This is heightened even more by the score, which really makes the overworld feel more epic. In fact, fact, the music throughout the game is really good. Seriously, it feels like they really nailed the presentation of the whole game. But Gerard, the whole world looks so big and empty, like it's completely devoid of life. Well, yeah, haven't you played any game on the N64? It doesn't really always have the power to fill in that many people. There are definitely points where even Ocarina of Time feels big and empty. Something else that looks cool is the enemies. Normally, when you start off with these big RPGs, you'll be fighting things like rats, slimes, other basic creatures. Instead, Quest 64 introduces you to the werehare, a tall hare in a hooded cloak. And I love it. In fact, there are plenty of great-looking monsters like Pale Riders, Death Huggers, Werecats, and Frog Kings. The last two are my favorites, but for very different reasons. Gerard, some monsters might look cool, but the main character looks so stupid. So I assume that you're talking about his hair, which looks like a combination of Alfalfa from The Little Rascals and Cameron Diaz from There's Something About Mary. But have you played an RPG before? It's literally a requirement at this point to have stupid hair, especially if you're the main character. I personally think this is a dumb thing to nitpick about in a game, just to make it sound way worse than it actually is. All I'm saying is that for the time it was released and the console it was released on, Quest 64 looks pretty good. And guess what, folks? I'm not done heaping the praise on this game because I like the combat as well. As with most traditional RPGs, Quest 64 has a turn-based system. Combatants are ordered by agility, with the fastest character going first. You then take turns hitting each other until someone wins. What Quest 64 does differently is that you can move around on your turn, giving you different ranges for your attacks, magic, or otherwise. Since you are a mage, you'll mostly be using different elemental spells to battle opponents, although I would personally find myself beating up as many enemies as possible with my staff. I know the game's all about magic, but if you give me a beating stick, I'm gonna do some beating. The 4 magical elements in the game are earth, fire, water, and wind. Go figure. They all do exactly what they sound like they do, with fire shooting fire, water shooting water, etc. But within these different elements are spells that have different ranges and areas of effect. So, for example, I'm mostly focused on fire. That means I wound up having a fireball I could shoot from farther away, a fire pillar that I could send up right in front of me, or a steam that could damage all enemies around me. Earth also has cool spells where you can send a rock rolling in front of you, or summon a whole freaking avalanche. This variety is pretty dang cool and makes you want to actually learn every spell. But Gerard, what about the terrible leveling system? Honestly, you might have a point here. There is a major flaw with the 4 elements in Quest 64. You're probably not going to use them all. This is because of what the different elements do and the leveling system itself. So in most RPGs, you have to level up by defeating enemies and getting experience. That's not the case in this game. In Quest 64, you can level up your magic in one of 2 ways: by leveling up your basic stats or by collecting spirits. Spirits are hidden throughout the world in different locations. They are a bit hard to see, but a question mark will appear above Brian's head when he is standing over one. Pick it up and you can level up a single element by 1. But the downside is that there are 98 of these across the whole game, meaning it is impossible to level up every spell even halfway with this method, since each of the 4 spells goes up to level 50. The other method is leveling up your basic stats: HP, MP, defense for taking hits, and agility for dodging attacks. Each of these has a different method of gaining experience. For HP, you need to hit opponents with your staff. For MP, you need to cast as many spells as possible. For agility, you just have to run around. And for defense, you need to get hit by the enemy. That is by far the stupidest one because you can only improve it by not playing the game. This all seems easy enough, but the major downside to this is that it takes forever to level up any of these stats. And if you want to level up more than 2 different elements of magic, you're gonna have to work on them all. Each element has unique spells that affect yourself. For example, wind can increase your agility, and fire can increase the damage you deal with your staff. Water is the only element with a healing spell, and that is absolutely necessary because you cannot buy healing items in the game, so there's no currency in Quest 64. So in order to get access to healing magic, I decided to focus on water. On the other hand, Earth has the most broken spell in the game: Magic Barrier. It makes you completely immune to magic attacks. This is ridiculous because pretty much all the enemy attacks are magic attacks. So you cast Magic Barrier, wail on your enemies for 2 or 3 turns, and then cast it again because you can't die. But I had an issue with that. I like fire and almost always choose fire over any other elemental spell. Since I had put all of my spirits into water and fire, that meant I had to grind up my earth magic to at least level 36 in order to get Mystic Barrier. So I ran into battles getting beat up left and right so I could eventually learn the magic that would make me immune to damage. By the time I had gained enough experience to learn Mystic Barrier, I had so much defense and agility from running around that most of the enemies either barely hurt me or missed me entirely. So in the end, I ended up wasting a a lot of time for nothing. Even though I wasn't immune to all enemy attacks, I still found the game to be incredibly boring after about halfway through to the second main boss. You see, despite the good intentions behind the combat system, it gets very repetitive when you're just using the same spells over and over again. On top of this, there are way too many random battles in each area. I'll give credit where credit is due. It's really cool at first that the transition from the overworld to the battle is so seamless. However, this means that you can easily see the spot in the distance where you are traveling to. Towards the end of the game, I just decided to run away from most battles just to finish the game. And it only took me 11 hours.
I went to Quest 64 with pretty low expectations, so I was pleasantly surprised with how the game started. It genuinely looks good for the N64, and I saw potential in the combat. But the more you work your way through this game, the different flaws just started rearing their ugly heads. But none of it was broken or offensively terrible. In fact, I've seen games that weren't good get saved by a great ending or even a completion bonus that was good enough. Unfortunately, Quest 64 is not one of those games. What a bummer.
Alright, so I did it all, essentially. I got all 98 wisps, I beat the big bad boss at the end of the game. In return, I spoke to a character named Shannon, who had been following me around, and then the screen quickly cuts to a lot of scrolling text, telling me about a lot of things that happened, and then credits. Huh. Well, that was a really f***ing dumb ending, I guess. I made the mistake of expecting more from this game. However, the boring scrolling text isn't the only ending to this game. In Telltale Monsters, the Japanese version of the game that was released later, you actually get some kind of cutscene at the very end of the game. You see a lot of different characters and their reactions to Brian having saved the day. After all of that, he boards a boat and sets sail to see the rest of the world, hinting at a potential sequel that never saw the light of day. And maybe that's appropriate. Quest 64 starts off somewhat promising in my eyes, but it is definitely not a game that rewards you for playing it, let alone completing it. More gameplay adds nothing. Even the story doesn't feel satisfying as you move throughout it, something that most RPGs have been doing well since the 1980s. What's really interesting to me, though, is that I think there's a good game somewhere in the mix here. Quest 64 looks great and has some fun gameplay ideas at its core. It just feels like everything else wasn't really pushed to match them. If a bit more time was spent finessing the leveling system or fleshing out the story, I'm sure we'd have a game that was remembered somewhat fondly. Hell, you can even see that with the improved ending in the Japanese version. Instead, we have a game that craps out after a few hours and descends into mediocrity. It never dips so far to be a bad game, but it's nothing to write home about. And to some people, that's worse than being outright terrible.
You know, I actually really enjoyed some of my time playing Quest 64. I loved the overall look of the game, exploring the open world was fun, and the battle system is actually really creative for its time. But the story is as generic as they come, and over time, the combat and gaining experience elements is a long and arduous task. It can be mind-numbing, but I still hold up that Quest 64 is not nearly as bad as people say. If you have an old copy lying around or find it for cheap, give it a shot for a little bit. You could definitely do worse for a few hours of your time. And who knows, you might actually start to like it. Probably not though, it can get really boring. But there are plenty of people out there who like Animal Crossing, so who am I to judge? So, with that in mind guys, I give this game my completionist rating of play it.